A bigger room, so I'm going to use my voice. My name is Mike Anderson. I'm from the city of Vancouver, and hopefully everyone's here to listen to 3 talks about local residential streets. I don't think we have a moderator unless somebody is hiding in the room here that wants to moderate. But, so we've decided to start ourselves.
I'll let you do your next one.
I'll be speaking last, I guess. And
So you,
first up, I don't have any biographies either, so I'll let Denver introduce himself.
Denver Igarta. I'm a transportation planner, city of Portland, Oregon. And I've been with the city for about 6 years, primarily working on active transportation, bicycle pedestrian projects and plans. And yes, my presentation is about residential streets, and I'm kind of excited to have heard a lot of the presentations that have been given, emphasizing the importance of broader themes beyond just bicycling, really about how bicycling contributes to a better urban life, to better quality of life, to better cities, and integrating the issues of health and the environment, and really focusing on that connection of place, the land uses and the transportation. And so my presentation really kind of draws on those broad themes in looking at what is the role of residential streets. We all know that they serve a mobility function, so they move people about from place to place. I don't know if but they also have a very important place-making function. These are the places where people live. Their homes are right outside their front door. They're confronted with these places, which is the public realm, which is their community. And so I started focusing on residential streets when I was hired by the city of Portland to help develop the bicycle plan for Portland 5 years ago. And over a 3-year process, we developed a plan for 2030, and that plan really densified our network, but had a lot of emphasis and a change of emphasis towards both the local residential streets and also towards better quality facilities on our busier streets. Our residential streets are a key component of what we called our low-stress bikeway network. And so giving residents conditions where people that are concerned about safety can feel comfortable taking their kids, people of all abilities, even if they haven't ridden a bike in many years, they can feel comfortable on these streets because these are the streets where they're given priority. So the thing that's a great opportunity about residential streets is that they have a low auto function. They have speeds that are more suitable to people walking and biking. And in Portland, just like Vancouver, it's built on a very traditional rigid grid system. So the pattern of streets, 60% of our streets are local streets, and the pattern provides for very quick, direct links to the places that people go, parallel to our arterial streets. And so I think most people that have been to Portland realize that we've started to focus a lot more on developing these local streets, and what we've done is we branded them as neighborhood greenways, which not only help bikes, but also pedestrians. They're green and safe. And so I'm talking about, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Portland, but I wanted to share research that I did in the fall of last year. It was funded by the German Marshall Fund, Urban and Regional Transportation Fellowship, which essentially paid for me to spend a month in Europe visiting 4 different cities in 4 different countries, interacting with my counterparts in these cities around the theme of my research, which this title is much shorter than the one in the program, which I've been, so it's livable streets where people live. So the places that are their homes, the residential areas, how can we start to make trade-offs to really give, to de-emphasize cars and give people priority? So I wanted to start off by just a quick definition of what a livable street is. It's not a clean definition, but I thought an easy way to do this is to compare it to what our typical streets are. Our typical streets are really car-oriented. They serve primarily the function of moving traffic. A livable street would be more people-oriented or resident-oriented to the needs and the uses of people that live there. A typical street is often unpleasant and sometimes even hostile to people. A livable street is comfortable and invites them to come. And I think the social aspects of a livable street are that I think before the auto age, we had streets that really knit communities together. That was the place where people met one another. And today our streets designed for cars are often divisive and they divide the community. And so what is it that allows a street to begin to, again, knit together the community? If it's a hostile environment right outside your door, you're less likely to want to spend time there. So you'll orient yourself towards your private space, to your backyard, to inside your house. And if we're talking about bicycling, the place where kids will first hop on their bike, where an adult will pull out their dusty bike and try and ride their bike for transportation, it's going to be right in front of their house. So it's really important to make these very safe and comfortable places for bicycling and walking, and just being in community. So a livable street gets you where you need to go, but it also invites you to stop and stay a while. So it's not just about movement of people. So streets occupy a very valuable and significant part of the public domain. In Portland, the majority of our public space which includes parks, rivers, open space, is in our public streets, our right-of-way. So it is a very important part of our city. And my question, starting my research, was how can these streets contribute more to creating a better living environment for the people of Portland? And looking at these European cities that I visited, I wanted to find out where is it that and how are cars tamed or de-emphasized in residential areas? Are there places for active living, for walking, biking, but also for playing? And are there opportunities provided, like spaces to gather for community to be built? And I'm going to show you a couple of slides. This is a typical street in Portland. And the thing about our local streets in Portland is we have one standard for them, and they're generally designed all the same way. So you have a street that provides for traffic in both directions and parking, and you have a green planter strip, and then you have sidewalks on both sides. That's the way streets are done in Portland, pretty much everywhere. And so my question is, how is space divided up on that space of the street, and where are people expected to be? In the example of Portland, 2/3 of the space is devoted to cars, either storing cars or moving cars. And so how can that space invite people and allow for use of people on bikes, or people walking, or people just interacting, or even playing? So these are just a few examples of how that shift in terms of how the street's design can start to, again, knit together communities. I really appreciated Gil's point yesterday in his presentation about how critical it is to lower the speeds on these residential streets. And in Portland, we did a survey in 2008 and found out that 58% of Portlanders limit walking, biking, and transit because their fear of traffic, basically, of cars. And so this is a barrier for us. And I'm showing this slide just to point out part of the problem. We had a rapid expansion, and this is nationwide, rapid expansion in our street networks at the same time as we had a rapid increase in miles driven by car, and also car ownership rapidly increasing. And so you can see in these two charts the period pretty much from the 50s to the 70s, 80s, of how quick that expansion was. And this is the legacy of the motor age and the legacy of our cities, because our cities are shaped to meet the needs of cars. My next point has to do with fuel prices. And this became a really important part of my research when I started to realize when it was that European cities I visited started to make their changes and shift towards de-emphasizing cars to provide for more traffic calm environments, to promote walking and biking, and also to mitigate the negative impacts of cars in residential areas. And you can see the first spike in real fuel prices happened in response to the oil crisis in 1973. And attitudes in Europe changed about the dependency on cars and also the impacts on the environment and the quality of life. And the second spike on this graph shows today. We're at a point where we need to make a decision once again. What is our choice? So kind of just to give you a quick overview of the places I visited, I wanted to visit 4 different countries. I did it in a month, so I spent a week in each country. I started in Munich, Germany, and the red part just emphasizes kind of the main reason I picked these cities. You know, they've been successful in de-emphasizing cars in residential areas, but they also have intense pressure to facilitate traffic and the growth in traffic. And so in Munich, it really is about a society that's very much oriented towards the car culture. In Rotterdam, it's a major port. It's also a huge urban area with a lot of diverse needs, but it has been built on more of a modern street system and design. In Copenhagen, they're seeing a rise in car ownership and in miles traveled. And the final city I stopped in was Malmö, Sweden, and they've had very significant, almost remarkable population growth in recent years. But again, all of these cities have had incredible success over the decades in mitigating the impacts of cars in residential areas. I'm just going to briefly touch on each of the cities. Munich has the highest pedestrian share. All of the cities I visited have over 40% of trips walking and biking, which is remarkable. To be able to have that much of your traffic occurring on those 2 modes of travel. Munich has the highest pet share. It has a number of tools that have evolved with time, mostly focused on residential speeds. The first was the Verkehrsberuhigte Bereich, which is a pedestrian priority street, assigning about a 7 km/h speed, so very much a walking pedestrian priority street. Later, in 1988, they developed a 30 km speed, and in Munich, they started to convert entire neighborhoods to this 30 km speed limit. Today, 80% of the streets in Munich are 30 km/h, 20 miles per hour. And the way they did that, if you look at this map, is they essentially defined the main routes, and those routes are the primary routes for through traffic, and they are their speed limits are 50 miles per hour. Everything that's green on the inside assigned 30 km/h. So the sign on the bottom, in 1995, they were given a new tool, which is the Fahrradstraße, which is the bicycle priority street, which is essentially a 30 km speed street, but where bikes are given priority, and they're allowed to ride side by side. In Rotterdam, it has the highest combined bike and pedestrian share. It's 50%, which is incredible. It's an unusual city for the Netherlands. It was rebuilt following near total destruction after the Second World War in a more modern style, a grand scale, big streets, tall buildings, really modern architecture. And the interesting thing about Rotterdam is that even though they built in this kind of American style and pattern, they still preserved protection for cyclists, and they have a very, very identical approach to Munich in developing these 50 km/h main routes and then residential routes at 30 km/h. Another interesting thing is that they basically in policy have said that no through traffic should be allowed in these residential areas. And you can look at the map on the bottom left, and you can see that street patterns change with time. So based on the pattern of the street, you can pretty much identify what decade it was built and how things evolved with each new iteration. And the other thing that I really was impressed with about Rotterdam is that the local streets, so these 2 photos on the right, they have the same function, they're in the same neighborhood, but they're designed to meet the context, to meet what is the density of the adjacent land use, what is the need for traffic, what is the need for on-street parking. So they're always improvising based on the conditions. Copenhagen, we all know Copenhagen as one of the best bicycling cities in the world. It has the highest bike share of all the cities I visited. But as I mentioned before, it's also experiencing increase in kilometers driven and car ownership. In Copenhagen, they've attempted to follow a similar pattern of converting entire areas to 40 kilometers per hour. That effort has stalled. They have a few, but another thing I wanted to point out is that they have a very interesting system for regulating speeds in the city of Copenhagen. They basically have kind of two tools. One, you can see both of the pictures on the bottom are 30 kilometer per hour streets. The difference is the street on the bottom right, which is the typical European sign for a 30 kilometer zone. It is a speed limit that's enforced. It's regulated by the police bureau. The blue sign is an advisory speed limit, which is in essence recommended, but it's the operating speed on the streets is held to 30 kilometers per hour because these are traffic calm streets. So there isn't the same need to enforce them. And so there are very interesting reasons why they choose one over the other, and I can explain them later if there are questions about that. Malmö, just across the Øresund Bridge from Copenhagen, is the third largest city in Sweden. It has the best balance in biking and walking shares, so it's a very walkable city, a long, impressive history of developing bikeways and building bikeways. The thing that's interesting is that the entire city, the entire urban area is, in the maps behind it, but it's roughly 5 kilometers from the center of town right here to the periphery. So the entire urban area is very close distance, but that urban area is given a single speed limit, 50 kilometers per hour. The way that they address speeds, especially in recent years, has been driven primarily by Vision Zero, reducing traffic fatalities and injuries, severe injuries in their city. And what they found is that they did research. They have tons of data on collisions and accidents, and what they found is that the biggest threat is on their 4-lane major arterial streets. And so they really focused on those. Those streets are, the speed limit is 50 kilometers per hour, but they basically, wherever there's a pedestrian or bike crossing, they drop those down to 30 kilometers per hour by introducing these speed bumps and crossings. So, and they've really mastered the technology to ensure that cars have to get down to 30 kilometers per hour on those streets. One interesting thing, though, is that less of the traffic calming is happening in the residential areas than is happening on these main streets. So 3 takeaways from my trip that I want to share with you include a new function for streets from my perspective that I didn't understand or know about that has been in place in Europe for many decades, and that's the sojourn function or the staying function of streets. The second is making walking and biking the smarter choice, or walking and biking is the smarter choice if we give people the options. The third is that the street environment needs to be designed at a human scale and at a human pace. So the first, the sojourn function. In the US, we know about traffic functions. We know about the mobility function for long trips, getting people from one point to another en route. And we also know about the access function and getting people to their destination. But in all of the cities I visited, there's also what's known as a sojourning function or a staying function, a function of a place and the need to be there and abide there, not just move through there. And so that sojourn function is applied in different countries in different ways. These are a couple examples from Copenhagen, and the one on the left is actually a very busy street, and this is an example for the public realm. This is Nordboge, I think I said that right. And this is a street that recently was converted, a very high profile project, but they created what they call talkscapes, or arranging furniture in a way that it allows and almost forces people to interact with one another. And so that's the example on the top left. On the right is more of a private type of social interaction that can occur, and that's through the permitting and development review, creating these semi-private areas on private property where people, as you can see in the middle graphic, can interact with their neighbors casually. So one more example on sojourn function, and that is a very concrete example of how the sojourn function is implied in Germany. And this is from the National Design Guideline for City Streets. So this applies to all of Germany. And it's a tangible engineering approach to how you can quantify or actually factor in sojourning. So in Germany, this is an example of a residential street. It's called a Wohnstraße. And they start by looking at the pedestrian traffic and the bicycle traffic needs of that street. And then they factor in the sojourning function of the street. And they'll look at whether there's needs for parking and delivery, or maybe even garbage pickup, that sort of thing. Next, they'll move on to transit. Is there a bus line or no? If there's not a bus line, then you can move down to the left side. If there is a bus line, you move down the middle. Then they look at traffic volumes on the street. These streets are meant to be residential streets, so they carry relatively low volumes of traffic. Next, they look at the right-of-way width, how much space is available. Based on that, then they determine what the cross-section of the roadway is going to be. And you have options depending on how much space there is. No trees, no parking. Parking on one side. Parking and trees on one side. Parking on two sides. Angled parking and trees on one side. And the thing that is quite interesting about this, like I said, in Portland we have one option. These are multiple options for that specific type of street. The way that we basically approach streets in Portland and in the US is, first of all, we look at how much right-of-way there is. How much space is there? Next, we find out whether or not there's fire requirements or transit access requirements, and we look at the traffic volumes. Then, once we know what the needs of the cars are, on-street parking and traffic, then whatever's left over generally is fought over by our bikes and pedestrian advocates. So the next point I wanted to make is about making bicycling and walking a smarter choice. And as I mentioned before, it is often the smarter choice in an urban environment because it's often fastest, it's often the most convenient, door-to-door trips, and it's also often the least expensive. But we can also implement measures that make it quicker, shorter, easier. This is an example on the bottom right of a graphic from Copenhagen. And the one on the left is a drawing I made just to show that peds and bikes have shorter trip distances that they'll travel, and they need a more dense network of streets and pathways to connect to the places they need to go quickly. And so in Sweden, this is a picture from Malmo, they have a lot of these street closures where they allow cyclists or pedestrians to cut through, but not cars. And I think you've probably seen many photos like that in the course of this conference. The next and final issue is the human scale and humane streets. This is not what I mean by human scale. This is the person who weighed my pumpkin during Halloween. I handed it to her and she told me how much I had to pay. But I loved the paperwork, so I had to put it in there. No, human scale has to do with, are the streets designed for the senses of people, for our speed of pace and how we move? This is actually a street in Portland where you can see we have 30 feet or 9 meters of space from curb to curb devoted to cars and no sidewalks. No, bicyclists, of course you use that space, but if cars are passing you, they have no cues to slow down when they're passing you. And as you can see, these are a few examples. This is from Munich, Germany, of a creative way to narrow that space by introducing kind of a parking area that's pervious. And then this is the Verkehrsberuhigte Bereich from Munich, the pedestrian priority street. You can see the scale is very much a human scale. So really there are two solutions. If it's a bike network route, if it's a typical residential street, you generally, a 30 kilometer or 20 mile per hour street, a bicycle pace, it's very much suitable for people and for particular bicycle traffic. But there are also occasions where you really want to prioritize the pedestrian. Then you have walking priority streets or walking pace streets. In Portland, we've, I think, become famous obviously for our bikeway network, and again, we're emphasizing these, what we're now calling neighborhood greenways. They used to be called bike boulevards, but they really are an evolution of bike boulevard because they're taking into account people. They still provide important mobility function. These are the primary routes, through routes for bikes, but they are safe, they are traffic calmed, and they provide for safe crossings. But they don't just provide for bicyclists and pedestrians. They actually are places, we try to create places where people can gather and spend time. We try to provide for as much green as we possibly can. Preserve trees that are there, plant trees if needed. And one of the main things that we're famous for now is integrating the stormwater from rotary runoff. And so the last point on human-scaled streets is I took 4 cases during my trip, 1 from each city, and I actually distributed a postcard asking people a few questions, and I was shocked to get them in my mailbox when I got home, just because I figured nobody would do it. But I had about 25 responses, and the amazing thing is that when I asked people what is it they like about their street, it wasn't a specific amenity, it wasn't a specific sidewalk or tree or anything. It had to do with the place, the people that they live with, their neighbors, the interaction with their neighbors. When I asked them how often do they talk to their neighbors, at least 68% of them talk to their neighbors at least weekly. So on these streets that are very people-friendly, very humane, very livable, there is a lot of interaction between the neighbors. What are the indicators of a livable street? The clear one is, for me, it had nothing to do with measuring out dimensions of the walkway or anything like that. If you saw sidewalk chalk on the street, or if you saw places to relax and play, but most importantly, if you saw people on the street, you know that it's a livable street. I just wanted to finally end on a example from Portland, because in Portland I just finished a street plan for a neighborhood that is the most ethnically diverse and has one of the higher poverty rates in the city. This is a former unincorporated area that we incorporated into the city in the mid-'80s after it had been developed. We inherited 50 blocks of unimproved gravel streets, and only 33% of the streets have sidewalks. So lacking basic infrastructure, lacking connectivity. Those streets, at the same time, I asked people, what do they want to preserve about those streets? I know what they want to improve. There's a clear lack of basic infrastructure, but what do you want to save? And what I heard back was, obviously, these streets are calm, quiet, there's not a lot of through traffic, but also we have mature trees, we have play spaces, we have opportunities for urban agriculture or gardening. And they wanted to preserve those things. And so we started to look at, how do we create a street that's 20 miles per hour, 30 kilometers per hour? We've just been given the authority to create 20-mile-per-hour streets on our bikeways. And so we started looking at narrowing the roadway, preserving the space for trees and common space. And so this is just one example. Here's the visualization along the right-hand side of that example of one way that we might be able to keep speed and at a human pace and provide for amenities that are provide for social interaction. This is my final slide. I'm going to conclude by saying that, again, that streets occupy a very important part of our public realm. And as cities continue to grow, we can no longer allow them to just serve the monofunctional purpose of conveying and storing automobiles. And even though a street was built originally to serve cars, just like this garage here, it can be converted to serve more functions and to meet the needs and interests of the community. And we can make the places that we live more attractive and more interesting. So thank you very much. Yeah. This was, I cut the